the next few classes will have surprise quizzes in the class as well. So be prepared. And I'll not tell you the night before, let's sleep on time and come refreshed. Initially, I was planning to do that, but then there won't be any surprise. Okay. We did talk about deforestation from time to time, and you guys mentioned, how deforestation is one of the biggest crises that the planet is facing. What do you think is the number one cause of deforestation in the world? Yes. Absolutely. And in terms of infrastructure, could you be more specific? It's already but yes, I mean, that's one of the reasons why we clear forest land. But one of the major reasons is that we want more space for our cattle, our livestock to be raised so that we could have more food security. So believe it or not, agribusiness is the reason why we are number one reason why we are losing our specifically the rainforests, which is why I think it is important. But before we look at, so in the beginning, I sort of hinted towards systems approach of looking at things, which is what we're trying to do here, where often we do not just look at the science, we also look at the people. We also look at how everyone has to come on the table. FARC is going on, so you already know how an event is put on for people, leaders, all stakeholders to sit on the same table and see how we can address the issues or the challenges of the planet. So that's exactly the approach that we want to take. We want to look at everything as a system. We want to know what's coming in, what's going out, without really focusing on one thing, while it's inclusive of the people that are there. So we'll slowly shift towards food systems. But before we think of food systems as one compact black box, let's look at the systems of food production that we have. So ideally, the food that we produce, for whatever reasons, is more focused on three things, right? You always talk about land, labor, and capital. And you would then, in terms of like the success of your food system, you will say this is the productivity. So if you go and speak with any farmer, they will tell you, I had XYZ productivity, so it's really good. Environment, resources, input, cost, proper pricing, that's not really something that they take into account. I mean, they do, but not really like every inch or in great detail. So they would just think about, how much money I spent and how much labor was there and what was the overall land consumption, and eventually like how much did you produce per unit labor. But that's generally being the focus. And so every discussion would almost always, whether it's economics or otherwise, would almost always look at it in terms of money, because your productivity or your production in the end tells you how much money you're going to get from the market. And that was the scale to measure success of agriculture or success of agribusiness, and nothing more. But if you think about the types of agricultural practices, there are several terms that we will use interchangeably. You use terms like, I'm sure you've heard about organic farming, I'm sure you've heard about sustainable agriculture. They're all more tilted towards environmental well-being, less input use. But you might have heard about mechanized agriculture as well, which is a more industrial agriculture. You might have heard about industrial agriculture as well, which is again the more modern form of agriculture. You might have heard about conventional agriculture. They all refer to the same set of categories where in the Green Revolution, a lot of chemicals, a lot of input, a lot of machinery, a lot of research was developed to make sure that agriculture thrives. And with whatever land or capital and labor we have, in the end, we should have higher yield. That was the focus, in most of those practices. And there are other terms, I'm not sure if I wanted to learn all of them, such as which are the cash crops, which are not cash crops. One term maybe that you should know is that there are smallholder farmers whose land holdings are really, really small. But agriculture is their only source of livelihood and sustenance. And so that kind of farming where they have very little land, but that land is important for their survival, is called subsistence agriculture. They produce only enough to meet their own nutritional requirements, but if they have extra, anything above their own use, they would sell it to the market. So in a way, it can also bring income to them. So smallholders, and in the context of Pakistan, smallholders is really important. I'll talk to you about the project that I'm doing, for which I'm now going to sing, which is also focusing on smallholders, because most of our farmers lie in the category of smallholder farms. Yes, sir.
So as a government, a smallholder farmer, from what I understand, let's say we are recorded by profits they go like instead of like farmers. How can we like directly communicate with like is that something which is possible like start consumers like us?
Yeah, I'll hopefully talk about this soon. Now you've talked about the value chain or the supply chain, where the farmer is dependent on the RP or the middleman, who is sometimes giving him the money, sometimes all the chemicals, sometimes all the seed, but then the productivity, farmer has little decision-making power and information on what's going in. So if the RP gives him seed which are hybrid, that haven't been tested before, and the farmer has promised him X, Y, Z productivity, if that is not received, then the farmer is already in debt of the RP because he's already gotten advanced money. So the money that he was expecting in return, he will not receive. Now imagine if that was added by, let's say, environmental degradation, let's say floods, let's say droughts, whatever the reason, and the farmer gets absolutely nothing. Then not only will, after all the hard work, have no money and no produce, will also be in debt of the RP. And the farmers that I met in Balochistan when I was there, most of them told me that they have a lot of money to pay back to the RP. And the fertilizers they bring, the pesticides they bring, it all sort of links because the RP is then linked to the market. And they have this connection where he says, use this fertilizer, use this pesticide. So how that entire process is manipulated is another reason why we need to look at the entire process as in a value chain, in a supply chain, rather than just looking at the field and thinking what's going in and what's going out in the productivity. Because if we are losing up to, let's say, 30% of it in the farm, then what's the point in producing so much in the first place? Maybe we would have with less input produced 30% less and improved our processing, transportation to make sure that that goes to the market. So how does that then impact the greenhouse gas emissions? Because every process within the agriculture is energy intensive. You use tractors, which run on fossil. You use a lot of products that are made with fossil. So you will have to then start thinking about that as well. Anyway, so these are like some of the terms that will come again and again. Also, when you talk about agriculture, they talk about these three things as well. Cropland is, of course, the land that you use to produce your crops. Rangeland generally refers to pastures, land that are used for grazing our cattle, our sheep, etc. And then fisheries is for, but all of this has to relate with food security. And I'm not sure how involved you are with watching contemporary documentaries, but if you have seen Kiss the Ground, which is also a documentary on Netflix, it's basically very related to the ideology that we discuss at the center, which is why I recommend it to a lot of students, where they are talking about how industrialized agriculture in the West has absolutely degraded the land and why we should not follow anything like that and why we should go towards what we under certain umbrellas more sustainable, nature-friendly, close to nature practices to make sure that our soil is healthy and but back to this concept, there's also one term that I would want you to remember because it's related to climate smart agriculture. It's called sustainable intensification, which means that even if you have small land, a very, very small land, you are able to get enough. So see how in extensive you have a lot of land, but you're not, you're able to get some output. But with intensive agriculture, you have very little land, but you're still able to get the same output. So it's possible to, using nature-friendly practices, increase your yield or increase your produce. And I think that's something, because I might use this term interchangeably, which is sustainable intensification or sustainable agriculture. So that I just wanted to know that I'm referring to practices that are close to nature with little land that is available in the end to increase your produce. And it's important because for a country, like I said, in Pakistan, where more than 80% of farmers are smallholders. So it's important for us to make sure that their produce is high. And if you remember tunnel farming, where they say because we do not have space, we need to grow vertically, then that's sort of sustainable intensification, because you do not have the land, so you're growing vertically rather than just similar to the urbanization practice. But that's just something for you to think about. And just like we had a look at the water and water availability around the world, it's just it just tells you how much land we have, how much of it is habitable, how much of it is being used for agriculture. Now imagine this, because the reason why we are seeing more land here is because of non-environmental friendly practices. We are degrading a lot of land here. So desertification is a phenomenon, again, that's happening because of extensive agriculture, because of extensive chemical use. And in the end, we just have things like dust storms or dust storms coming in. Those lands become practically uninhabitable. So from this land, they eventually turn into those barren lands. So it's and how are we sort of reclaiming that land or trying to have more agricultural food security for the 9 billion people that we say will have by 2050 is by clearing more land here. Why we degrade some of this here. Anyway, so within that agricultural land, we then have more, so just a sense of understanding that even though we focus more on agriculture, the 50% land of the habitable land that is used for agriculture is actually, out of that 50%, up to 80% is used for livestock. So it's used in meat, dairy, and other products, and not necessarily crop. So only up to 23% of it is. And if you even divide that Cropland, then it will talk about how much calories you're getting. But the more you look at it, and again, I'll refer you to one of my favorite sites, which is our world data, where you can go and play with all this data to see what's happening around. But we need to look more into details to understand which sector is contributing to the land, the environment more, which is why towards the end of the lecture, maybe as we go through the course, we'll focus a lot on methane that is coming from livestock rearing and why, the similar debate on why meat is being bad. But also without not forgetting that it's also good for your nutritional health. How did we start agriculture? I do not want to go back to history, but you all remember, we kept seeing it in our childhood in all the history books, how we became from hunters and gatherers to eventually wanting to settle, living in one place, domesticating wild varieties, making sure we had crop to get a little more security. And not only did we then have food, but also had wood that could be burned. So just meeting our own needs, our own requirements for food, fiber, paper, energy, whatever the basic requirements are. But if you look at it, most of it is related to your food system, because it's coming from either the forests or the agricultural practices that we have. Are healthy agricultural systems or is sustainable agriculture really possible? We always refer to the developed world for how they are shifting to environment-friendly practices. But India, I remember when I just returned back just like around 2 years ago, India had an entire state converted into 100% organic state. So it is as possible in the developing world, and people are already doing it. So while we shift towards the input-intensive agriculture, around us in our neighborhood, there are people like countries that are shifting to agriculture. So Sikkim is a state in a way that sort of guarantees why, then it guarantees them some financial good with that. Because I'm sure they've now contributed their food to the world around as well. But why is it important for our folks? Okay, we want to survive and we want to live, but we also do not want to be just selfish and thinking about ourselves. This is an image that I've taken from the chapter in your book, and I'm sure you'll go back to it and look at it. We've been talking about the four spheres. We've been trying to make connections between the four spheres. We've been trying to look at how the four spheres of the environment are impacted. Agriculture is one of those sectors that is heavily impacting our sphere. So I'll not really go into details because you can read it up yourself, but from biodiversity to soil to water to air to then of course human health, or whether you take it in the form of bioaccumulation because of the chemical input use and how that impacts our health, to use of chemicals such as pesticides, fertilizers, how those then eventually impact the human health as well. And then some indirect impacts as well. So for example, we have been talking about eutrophication. Similarly, if those chemicals contained heavy metals, how that would enter our water bodies and then eventually and impact us. So yeah, so I'll leave it there for you guys. A lot of reference to GHGs, but you already know it, so there's no point to explain it. Back to conventional agriculture, the agriculture that we are practicing now, which is input intensive. By input intensive, I mean we're trying to almost always double our labor, double our fertilizer, double our pesticide. We're always relying on the market to tell us what to do. There are now more pest attacks, so automatically we are going back, and almost always relying on an agricultural doctor sorts where we go to them and tell them that my land is not really giving me the biomass that I expect. So eventually they will say, apply this much fertilizer. We'll talk about what the practices should be and how we're compromising on the principles of nature and making it or inputting more than is actually required, because every crop has a nutrient requirement and every crop has a water requirement. So we'll talk about that as we go to the lectures of conventional agriculture. So the conventional agriculture or the industrialized agriculture looks at a more input approach to increase the output. So whether that's animals, fishes, cropland, crop product, it's like I said, it's yield focused, it's productivity focused, and that productivity is often brought in by a lot of chemicals and better seeds, better machines, bigger machines, and so on. And in the process, you, of course, the agricultural process includes getting the right seeds, sowing it, giving it enough water, giving it enough chemicals, and then eventually harvesting it or taking the meat out of the meat industry, whatever process you are looking at, whatever you want from that food industry, but there is a process. The reason why I genuinely put it like that is because we almost always look at the plant, and here I'm referring to just one plant, but a farm, the place where you get your food from, we almost always look at it as a factory, where we say if you put this much, this is the kind of output that you get, and just as I was mentioning before, there is no, it's no longer the same because our soil is not healthy, and also because we have changed the process so much, and we have intensified our agriculture in the wrong way. So we're not giving the soil the ability to really have it. And I'm sure that some of us who know a little bit about agriculture know that we do not repeat the same crop. So we call it alternative cropping, or to make sure that the same plant doesn't go there, because if it has a certain nutrient requirement and you keep bringing it each year, then it will take up that particular nutrient in the soil and so very basic intuition skills for the farmer to know exactly what needs to be done. So we will get back, and that's the reason why I bring the farmer to the class, because the farmers know. We know so much more than we ever could learn from the books. And they know it because they practice it and they can instantly see what the output of the juice is. But anyways, so we look at this as a miniature factory, and we say this, and I almost always refer to the idea of the current value chain, where you expect the tree to give you same size, same kind, same color patterns. So for example, if a farmer was to sign a contract with, let's say, a particular chain, a store here, the store would say all the apples should be more or less similar. We know that that's not how nature works, and that's not generally how, like, you get that with the GMO or genetically modified because you directed the size, but naturally that cannot happen. And as we know, the more nature friendly it is, the more healthy it will be for our health. So this entire model of looking at this as an industry with an input and output and expecting a certain type, size, shape is, I don't think, in the long run. And when we look at this process, we hardly ever think of the cost that the environment has to bear. And so I think that's something really important when it comes to agricultural practices. How is conventional agriculture really called conventional agriculture? It was basically in the Green Revolution. These are the principles that they applied in the conventional agriculture to increase the yield or productivity, to meet the food requirements of the ever-rising population. First is tillage, and I hope you remember these terms because Asif sir, who is coming next Wednesday, he'll be using a lot of these terms for his lecture, so please make sure that you know what all of these terms mean. Till means plowing with a machine, generally the tractors, and generally what happens is soil or the land serves as a carbon sink. So we know that carbon dioxide is being fixed, it's converted into plants, grass, etc. And then eventually it becomes organic matter, degrades and becomes a part of the soil. So that's why soil is often called sink. What happens when you till or and the basic principle, and you need to again remember this for the practice that Asif sir has developed, is that the soil should almost always be covered. Because only then would it take more water in, and only then would it retain the nutrients or the organic matter inside. So its water holding capacity would increase, there will be less flooding, there will be less acidification, and that's the idea. But if you plow it, if you make the soil naked, then you will allow the organic matter to be, you will bring it in contact with oxygen and to be oxidized and carbon dioxide, which is why very often with agriculture they say, if with the plowing process they'll show you how CO2 is being released, it's basically just exporting the oxygen and oxidation, therefore resulting in the sink releasing the carbon dioxide. Yeah. So you have seen like very intensive tills, and again naturally if you look at it, like I said, your plant in the root zone has those bacteria, has those worms that have the ability to create those digs, tunnels for the organic matter to degrade, but also for nutrients to be fixed from the atmosphere. And then that has been happening naturally. You do not need to tell the plant what to do. You just need to give it the right conditions. And then we also will talk about some air that the plant needs. And like I said, there is a process for life in the long time to give that space and water to the plant. And of course, the plant will need some water, some nutrients. The process in which carbon dioxide is brought fixed into the ground is called carbon sequestration. Carbon in itself, the soil in itself is called a sink. Oceans are also called a sink for the same reason they absorb carbon dioxide. And when we compromise on it, when we make the land barren, when we topple it upside down, then automatically we're releasing it back. And if you remember when we were talking about soil, I told you that it's the top layer, which is more organic matter, which is important because that's where the roots are, right? So if you are toppling it over, you're already messing the structure up. So technically, that shouldn't be the case. And the practice that Asif is doing, which you'll read, is the opposite. So I put a line because I did not want to talk about it later. I just want to talk about it now. So this is called zero till, which means that you have these hard grain breakers, but they do not topple the entire soil around. They just make space for the new plant to be sown. So the entire land is in plot. And so till, which is the conventional agriculture, where we almost always thought that we had to topple the soil. Every time you harvest a crop, you have to do that. That's actually not the case. And our sister will come and prove it next time with the practice that is following. Okay, and the next is then monoculture. Now, why did we adopt monoculture? Which is like the same crop for as long as you see, as far as you see, nothing else. And then of course, just look at that and then look at the harvesting process. Same machine, same techniques, yes, we can. Absolutely, absolutely. So treating it as a factory, knowing exactly what's going in, it's all uniform, which means the same kind of machines can go, which also means the same kind of chemicals can go, which also means that the labor will be reduced. Because imagine if we have polycropping, which is environment friendly practice, then the same machine won't be able to harvest, let's say, 2 different crops at the same time. And we look at how that can be overcome, but the practice is the same. And it's been a part of the industrialized agriculture. And the important thing is, like I said, for these farms to be connected to the market, and the market almost always relies on quantity. Can you give me XYZ amount of price throughout the year? A smallholder farmer can promise that, but a big farmer, a big landowner-owning companies can promise that, and they can promise that through this, where again they'll have to put a lot of input to get the better. Now, traditionally or naturally, that's not how things happen. We all generally use like the seeds that we have at home. It can have a mix of varieties. So we use different varieties. At the same farm can have, although this is changing now, but the same farm can have multiple variety or polyvariety. And then I want to put a few other methods. So like I said, here, you want the machine to come at a time, harvest, clear the land for the next sowing season. Whereas here you are intercropping, which means that once one of the crop is ready to be harvested, the other starts growing. So automatically there's less disturbance. So you've done polycropping or intercropping such that one crop is being harvested while the other is growing. And people are practicing this. So that's called intercropping, making sure that between crops there is a gap, there's a distance, and that productivity increase. Depends on land, of course. In Punjab, as you know, has a very rich soil. You use or practice agriculture throughout the year. In places like tough, cold places like some in Balochistan, KPK, as well as the north, we generally take winter breaks because it's impossible to practice agriculture. But that means that our land has the ability to hibernate, to recover, to rejuvenate, unlike the landscape, which is why we're now becoming more and more important. But one of my favorite terms, and again, like I said, sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture, they have several practices. So it's not a set, it's not a set formula that I, as a farmer, do the same things that somebody else is doing. But this is one of my most favorite practices, which is agroforestry, which means you mimic a forest. Because in the forest, you have different canopies. These leaves then shed and give more organic matter to the soil. They also give shade, which means the evaporation rate will be slower, which means that you need to put less water in. And a lot of other benefits that we'll start thinking about as we move through the process. Next is irrigation. Yes, sir.
In the province, there is also perception of the farmers that when you sow 2 crops in a land, it's the power of the years that you go up with that place, like up over and productivity that will ज़्यादा में एक crop को
harmful and a problem.
Yeah.
So intercropping you can mention so the conveyor
Everything's very tricky. So we'll talk about assets. So even though he claims that everyone's like trying to copy him, there's actually a lot of resistance, partly because when you recommend things like you're not just talking about environment friendly practice, you're also standing up against all the markers, fertilizer, seed, every other marker that's just there that knows कि इस टाइम फार्मर को ये देना है, फार्मर को बताना है ये वाला काम कर लेगा, पार्टनरशिप करनी है, सैंपल देने 2 साल सीड दे देंगे, तीसरे साल उनको खुद से रिलाय कराना है. तो जहाँ पे फार्मर हाथ में बंधे हुए, they don't even know the science. Anything that they're told now is what they have to accept, because जो input आ रही है उसके बारे में कोई they're not sufficient. I would have accepted that argument if it came with proper research. But just saying it, doesn't prove anything. To me, like I said, and I'll give you an example. In those crops, there might be possibility that one has a nutritional requirement that's totally different from the other. So one requires more N, but the other requires more P. So there is an NPK ratio. We talk about fertilizer, which is probably next slide. That NPK ratio is very, and that NPK ratio will depend on the health of the soil. So even like when we're applying fertilizers, and for that, I think I'll go back to the science. So the science is what is the nutrient requirement of that crop, and what is the quality of the soil. If the soil is able to meet that nutrient requirement, there's no point for us to do anything else. There's no point for us to, but then again, how do you say this to the farmer? So I'll come back to why it's so difficult for farmers to adopt technology as such, and why they would just blindly follow whatever they're told. So they have seen this, right? They've seen the success of this. They've seen these people make money. So obviously they go after them. They're not come and speak to me because I'm a scientist and know what it would mean or what impacts it would have on the long term. They'll almost always go to this big farmer and say, "Aapne batayenge, aapne tractors denge, aapne guide kare." So, and then unfortunately, that's how things work. But the same kind of goes for irrigation as well. We think that jitna pani doge, utni productivity. So you'll Punjab mein, even in Sindh, you'll see conflicts over water. People fighting, killing each other over water, because they think that water zyada milega to hi produce hoga, which is partly true. But then, why do you need water? You need water because, of course, it's an important component of photosynthesis, but otherwise, if you compromise on this, as the temperature rises, evaporation will be that transpiration will be, again, it will vary for different crops. वो हर प्लांट के अलग होते हैं, दरख्त के लिए बहुत फर्क होता है, छोटे घास के लिए बहुत फर्क। अब अगर मेरा mindset ये है कि if I'm putting an onion, and this actually is a mindset, if you're growing onion, you need to give it as much water as possible, as many irrigation cycles as possible. There are studies, and I'll not quote them, but I could just tell them about it. So for example, there are studies that will tell you why you shouldn't be irrigating onion 50 times, which is what people do. So for example, research would show that 30 times is also enough. And then there would be another research that would say, why don't you just use drip and only give it enough water for the roots to be developed, and then you do not need to irrigate the whole land, you just need to irrigate that. उसमें भी थोड़ी argument क्योंकि generally if you restrict water, then you restrict the root zone. और आप naturally, like you want the roots to go dig into the soil and make the soil more open, which is air tunnels or degradation or nutrients into back there. That would only happen if we allow that process. So थोड़ा वो compromise criticism है with high efficiency irrigation system, which is drip or sprinkler, जहाँ पे बहुत close to the plants for water penetration. But that technology is great for countries like Israel that have started it, right? क्योंकि उनके वहाँ the kind of land that they have, they cannot afford to overly irrigate it like we do here. But in any case, water is becoming scarce, and we need to think about why do we need that much water to increase the yield, because this is again a myth. that needs to be broken in the communities that we have. Pakistan is said to have the biggest irrigation system, or उसके अंदर there's several dams, there's several barrages, और कौन सी river पे वो placed हैं. So we have an extensive irrigation system developed in Pakistan. And hold on, we don't have a TA here? Who's taking the attendance? Yusuf is my volunteer TA. Can you pass the paper on? Thank you. So yeah, so we do have an extensive agricultural system in Pakistan, which means that we use surface water, which is the glacial melt, which is coming from upstream, and we are storing it at different places and also redirecting it. So there are canals, there are linked canals. We make sure that that surface water goes to different spaces, and we're able to do that. Our surface can, of course, there are different ways in which you irrigate. I talked a little bit about high efficiency irrigation system, which includes techniques like these, you have to have sprinkled right. And of course, this is how we normally do it. This is what people want to shift towards in climate smart. We'll try and think about that. But I've almost always fancied the practice pares so much that when I went to Balochistan, I wanted to see pares. So pares is a practice because it's generally really warm and dry. They used to have these underground water channels that the communities need to prevent the evaporation water. Absolutely. But then do you think we still have it, or do you think it's gone? In Balochistan, this practice.
I think
it's gone. Because we now extract groundwater and the water levels are not as high as they used to be. Which means that there's very, very deep, and now wherever we went, there were just solar pumps extracting water and very, very low levels of groundwater in the province. But I just want to refer to, because we did have indigenous practices. We did think about Yes, sprinklers need drip. So the drip is like very similar to going very close to the plant and then just dripping it. It opens and closes, and there are different nozzles. It's very expensive. Why we just that one nozzle replacing it is very expensive, but there are very easy techniques. One is you just have holes and you allow for it to just flow naturally. The other is where you can turn on and off the and then there are other automatic ones as well. So based on pressure, so they can go from very low tech to very high tech. But while we were at it, I thought, I have told you that Pakistan uses most of its water in agriculture. This is the data. I'm sure those of you who work with data, they go to FAO Stat, which has data from around the world. And I was just researching Pakistan and then agricultural water withdrawal compared to, how much water are we using for agriculture from 96, 95, to 93 in 2018. So most of the water that we are using is actually going towards agriculture, which is why food and food systems are really important in Pakistan. Oh my God, there's very little time. Okay, right. So, okay, I'll leave the slide and then we'll go straight to inorganic fertilizers. So like I said, we are now using different synthetic components to meet that NPK ratio, which is required for the plant. So based on the nutrient requirements, or well, not on any nutrient requirements, we just give bags and bags of fertilizers to the farmer and allow us them to just apply it randomly, which should not be the case. Like I said, there are practices that are recommending otherwise. They think, which Sharif, so when he comes, will tell you that no input agriculture is possible. I used to think it would be possible, but he thinks it's possible. And then I would thought, okay, maybe he's talking about things like composting, where you degrade the food waste and you use it as a conditioner for the soil. He's not even recommending that. He just says that plain zero input agriculture and food production is possible. So it'd be nice to see what you guys think. Because I went from there to yes, if we look around, it can be scientifically, hypothetically possible, but he is doing it on the ground to show it to you with So yeah, because fertilizers then related to eutrophication. A lot of you in the quiz didn't know that eutrophication is caused by nitrates and phosphates. That was absolutely heartbreaking. But in any case, like for all of these products, you will know which one is using more fertilizers. Just the, here it's high because for the fodder production, which is one of the biggest problems with beef or livestock industry, you have higher eutrophication around in the water. So it's not just agriculture, it's agriculture in the livestock sector as well. And then chemical pest control. So we will talk about, we have been talking about persistent organic pollutants, finding out how those chemicals bioaccumulate in our body, and the Stockholm Convention, how it banned some of these crops. Unfortunately, most of them are still in use in Pakistan. They're very infamous ones like DAP as well, that's fertilizer. So they're very infamous ones which DDTs and others which are still used in countries like Pakistan, although they're banned in rest of the world because we have malaria and other flies around us as well. But pest is not just an insect. Pest can be a weed as well. So just to give you a sense of what a pesticide would be, it could be herbicide, fungicide, insecticide, or it could be a rodenticide. So it depends on what kind of pest would attack your field. It can be different. The pesticide can be natural or synthetic. Most of what we use in the fields is synthetic, but there are alternatives available to chemical pesticides. So, of course, there is this conventional model, but there's an opposite model as well, where even, for example, things like a vinegar spray can be given to a pest. So, if you must have a garden and if that garden is pesticide, you do not have to use pesticide. This is, for example, a practice, and this could relate to what Ali was talking about. That how do you tell the farmer that integrated pest management is good or intercropping is good. Because if you grow these three plants, and this is back in the olden times, in the Roman times, where farmers used to grow beans, squash, and corn together, where bean will have a stand, a support, in the form of corn to just grow on, and then squash will cover the ground. And like I said, covering the ground is really important because the pest could be a weed as well. And if you have squash growing in there, it will stop the weed from growing in. So naturally, you now not only have food security, but you also have environmental security as well. And this was not being practiced, this is not being practiced by us. This started in, like I said, in the Aztec times when they didn't know what the science was, but they knew how each one of them was contributing to, and basically replicating all the principles that we talk about now, about the several principles of saving our soil, keeping it healthy. And the sixth big practice is gene manipulation or genetic modification or genetically modified. We have been doing it naturally as well. If you know, people almost always keep the wild varieties of cherry, olive around the field because they allow for selection. Sometimes the farmers introduce it themselves for artificial selection to be allowed because as the gene manipulates, the variety becomes better. In Mexico, for example, like we were talking about corn. Corn was domesticated by Mexicans, I think, and over several years. So it wasn't always just corn. They allowed for grasses to artificially, genetically mutate or manipulate, and then become these big corns that we eat today. So, again, it has been done, and they know how to do it. But what science has done to it is instead of waiting for it to happen naturally, we now just take that one gene out when we want. So, which is why I gave you the video. Let's say if it's drought resistance, then you would just pick that one trait out, introduce it to the next plant, and make sure that the next plant then has that characteristic going on. So you will genetically modify the seed. You will genetically modify that variety and ensure better food security.
So, let me 2050, it's expected that population is in the rise to 9 billion. So I wanted to just ask about the feasibility of outdoor farming because just as Singapore could be vertical farming and just greenhouses in general are something which is being invented, and they have shown it's very consistent with you virtually do the pathogens or pests वगैरह होते हैं, and they can pretty much keep like the production consistent throughout like the whole year. In that sense, our food production is काफी that's something which we can achieve by this, or like we have to like simply rely on like
Yeah, so this is one of the reasons why I sent you the other video, which was urban farming. Because generally, Singapore again, or some of these countries do not have enough land, which means that they need to focus on vertical farming. Similarly, places of just हमने cities को complete structures दे दी, and there's no space for us to really farm close to home. That's when you can use your basement as a vertical farm. And that's why I referred you to the video of AeroFarm and showing how these young, and this is now becoming a field that the younger population is attracted to. Agriculture, or that soft agriculture, climate smart agriculture is no longer the field that you will leave for, the farming community. It's becoming an area for researchers. It's becoming a fashionable area for people to produce their own food, to make sure that they're not eating chemicals or they don't know what they're eating, which is why I referred you to the video on air farm and farming in the cities. And you will also see how they control the temperature just to make sure that the food is more secure. In the case of GMO, there's a lot of trade-off, advantages, disadvantages. For example, yield could be promised, those cosmetic standards of food production could be promised, but then and we could introduce things like pest management into the seed, so we'll allow the seed to fight that as well. But then we're stopping it from naturally evolving, and we do not know if there's a sudden change in climate or a new pest coming in that the gene is not aware of, and what that could mean for the overall production. Opposite of that is sustainable agriculture, soil conservation agriculture, regenerative agriculture, whatever you call it, but the idea is that you keep it neutral. You do not release a lot of gases from it. So, sort of driven towards the net zero, where whatever you're putting in, you're canceling out, but also making sure that you are copying the ways of nature to then ensure, not allowing the pests to attack. For example, in this case, you have a windbreak, and the neighboring farm has a pest, then that windbreak would stop those spores from coming to your very simple technique, but a nice technology to come in. Similarly, contouring, generally, like if you have straight lines, the water absorption will be low, so you'll have water coming in, and as we say, agricultural water, 70% of the agricultural water is wasted. So imagine we have up to 93% of water going into agriculture, more water like leaving the farm with nitrogen and phosphate. So if we mimic the natural patterns, how the river flows, then we allow for water to remain in the river for long time. So it's not just going straight out, but it's like coming in and traveling. So contouring, for example, is another practice. Any cropping where again it's sort of agroecology, so mimicking forest with the coming close to forest, getting in that shape. Sometimes, for example, you could grow alfalfa with a tree, so alfalfa is nitrogen fixing, automatically doesn't meet the nutrient requirement of the tree. So how these natural principles can be played with. Terracing, of course, is something that we do in the mountain communities a lot. Again, it's soil conservation agriculture because we make those terraces to make sure that the soil wouldn't just wash away. So we give that space, but also do not disturb the land too much. So that's something that we could call soil conservation agriculture. There are other names for it as well. And just read them, but I thought it would be important for you to know that they more or less mean the same thing. But they're also not one specific recipe or technique. There are a number of ways in which you can do. So like I said, one of my most favorite ones is now regenerative agriculture, which believes that even if you're using a tree, any resource from the ground, it's regenerating. It's not destroying, it's not removing the tree, it's sustainably harvesting from the environment to not degrade the environment. Okay. I know we have very little time, but let's let us quickly cover food systems. So we're talking about systems of food production. Now we look at food systems. So of course, it can have a lot of smaller systems in between, where there can be a market system through which a farmer is connected to the market. There can be a farmer system or farming system where farmers have a farmer union, a cooperative, a financing system, a health system, an energy system, a machinery system. They can have a lot of these systems inside. But for food systems to be sustainable, you have to bring all of these into one place, into one system, to make sure that they're all complementing each other. And also to make sure that they follow the value chain approach, which is from production, aggregation, processing, distribution, and consumption. So from the farm to your fork, to your plate, it's not only reducing poverty and giving food security to everyone in the chain, but it also has the right regulations, policies, etc. Because as we'll see, fertilizers, pesticides, all of them have a lot to do with the policies that we're making, the governments are making, with the help of these big companies that practically run the system. So looking at it as a whole is probably the way to go. And in the value chains, our general approach was just bringing food from the farm to the consumer, whereas in a more sustainable approach, we make sure that whatever value chain we have, whether it's a local value chain or we are targeting international markets, it should be sustainable and it should benefit the society. And it should have those institutions and policies that will ensure that. So on the one hand, it is very, very scientific. Everyone needs to know, what the food production system is, how it works. But on the other hand, for it to work, actually, you need to have all of these social elements incorporated in. And as I keep telling you, the objective of this course is also to let you know that these are not standalone processes. They're not just a scientist's problem. They're also as much a policy. So I'll let you look at this, not necessarily this, but how much GHG is emitted, how much land. So land use, land change is something, like I said, deforestation is caused by it. You'll always, whenever you read about agriculture, you talk about land use, land change, and then land cover, and a lot of GIS maps. I didn't bring the book, which is in my office, but I'll bring it next time where you'll see. Within Punjab, there are 14 agroecological zones. Each zone has different types or kind of microclimate, which means that you cannot have a standard policy for the whole Punjab. You need to know which particular zone, what varieties should be grown, what should the intercrop mechanism be. So it's easy to just call it sustainable environmental practice, but what would that mean to a small community living in Bahalpur compared to a community living in Patan? So, those are the things that I also want to think about. A lot of freshwater use, a lot of eutrophication, and biodiversity loss. And again, biodiversity loss is sort of connected to removing the forests. But you have it in your books. The reason for desertification, which I say is the biggest problem, of course, you need many more things, but it could be various. It's not just overgrazing, or it's not just deforestation to change forest lands into cattle ranching lands, but also erosion, compaction, the water logging, and the natural cause of desertification, which is conversion of a healthy soil to a desertified soil. And there's a lot of discussion on this. I don't know if you follow this debate on desertification of land. One of the reasons could be climate change, which is too much rain, too little rain, no promises, a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere, warming, changing in temperatures, changing the way in which organic content in the soil operate. So automatically, there are a lot of ways for it to work. But back to the value chain approach, which is from farm to then, whatever markets it's going to, there is a lot of GHG emission. And that GHG emission could be at several steps in the value chain. So the GHG emission could be when you're changing the land use, land type, or in the transportation. And this sort of tells you how in each value chain, in each crop, so just for you to think about how this works, the GHG emission comes from at several steps of the value chain. And for some, it could be really high. So for example, in the beef industry, your farm GHG emission is sort of the highest, as well as the land use factor, which is obvious. Thinking about the lecture that we discussed, these two are the major contributors of the GHG emission, and the rest of it not so much. So if we control our GHG emissions here, we could convert this into a more sustainable food system. And I think I'm glad that Roger sort of already mentioned it, but if there is 26% of, in the previous graph that we saw, 26% of the GHG emissions is due to agriculture or food production, 6% of it is actually wasted. So we can reduce that 6% GHG out of the 26 that is coming from agriculture or co-agriculture. I also wanted to just highlight, I don't know if you guys happen to have read the Climate Smart Agriculture book that's come out from FAO for Pakistan and Balochistan, Pakistan, Punjab, and now for Sindh. This is from that report I just took it yesterday, and it shows how agriculture is one of the biggest contributors to GHG emissions after energy in Pakistan. So just to give you a sense of scale of why we should be worried for climate change and agriculture in Pakistan. And that brings me towards the last section, which is farming in the cities. How many of you were able to watch the video? I like how the rest of you just chicken out in the entire conversation and leave it to me and these 4 or 5 people who are participating in it. You raise your hand. Maybe I said your name wrong. Your name? See, I got it right. I said farming in the cities. कि वीडियो किसने देखी थी और क्या देखा था उसने? Okay. Right. So like I said, if we go vertically, if we have more controlled environments, we can control the temperature, we can control the pest, which means that in terms of climate change and equipping ourselves as the temperature change and reducing the GHGs, having more control, because in a farm you do not have a lot of control. For example, if I and Asad are two neighboring farmers and I'm practicing organic farming and Asad is being supported by corporate industry and is using a lot of pesticides and fertilizers, when Asad's agriculture wastewater enters my field, which is loaded with pesticides and fertilizers, my farm is actually not organic anymore. So even though I am going all in for sustainable agriculture, just because of a bad neighbor, I cannot really get myself certified. Whereas here, if I just do it in one of the workshops that I have at home, then I have more control. Then Asad cannot damage me or my agricultural produce. So, there are these ideas sprouting up. Like I said, it's very attractive with your generation. It's, farming is no longer for the down for the less privileged, but it's becoming. And if you see in Karachi and other cities, there are now a lot of these elite urban farmers who have contracted out lands and are producing organic food. So farming, of course, was either for the very rich or the very poor, but now it's become more fashionable for the younger generation to come in and bring these scientific tools and interventions to it and producing their own food. Yes, sir.
Is that not very energy intensive? A lot of lights and a lot of other control layers.
But I think if you look at the offset, so these guys have calculated that as well. And even though I give example of this only, it also, a lot of people do it now on their rooftops as well. So if you follow some younger farmers mostly in Europe, they're doing it in their rooftops. So I was looking at, I think, an office in Japan that has these farms inside their offices. For example, if we were in this room and we had a rice paddy right in the middle, or maybe like, I don't know, a cucumber, the lights are on anyway throughout the day. We are giving them that cycle of night where the lights will be switched off. So that way it's just using the same energy that all of us are using. So there are those setups that have done otherwise. But I think if you look at this, let's say if this food is coming literally from your neighbor, or there are a lot of restaurants in the US that also do it. Otherwise, they would procure a certain vegetable from I don't know where in Europe or somewhere too far in the US. Now, if they're growing it in their own basement, then look at the value chain of the transportation costs, the energy there. So I think that's how they offset that's what they think the trade-off is in terms of the benefits. But I like this concept very much. But how would you justify? So I sort of gave this away when I was talking about the bad farmer. I said it was in my neighborhood, but you can't just go on and say I am a Alliance certified or Rainforest Alliance certified farmer. There is a whole process, just like we looked at the standards, we looked at the EIA. There's a whole process for getting these certifications, a monitoring mechanism. So you can't just claim to be fair trade or paying your labor better. If you're not doing it, there has to be a regulatory mechanism for it to make sure that any food you buy has a fair trade, because it's still more ethical. And I promise I'll stop in these last two slides. Back to what Assessor will be talking about in Wednesday's class. Like I said, the soil shouldn't be barren, it should be covered. And in his agricultural practice, which he calls picnic, which is Fedavar Kudrati Nisana Kashkari, he tries to cover the soil and not keep it barren like this one, which means get temperature control and moisture quality, just the things that we're talking about. So that's like the concept of mulch. He'll talk about mulch a lot, just keep that in your head. But this has nothing to do with his practice, by the way. I wanted to bring in the infamous plastics into agriculture. All the tunnel farming, which is called climate smart agriculture, is actually a lot of plastic being introduced into, finding new ways to use plastic in our life. So this is now called plasticulture. It's becoming more plasticulture than agriculture, because we could have used waste leaves as much, but we used plastic. We could have just used canopies, mimicked agroforestry, but we're now using low, medium, and high tunnels to grow vertically, to have more control in a space, and then have more produce. But the question remains that even though it's in a way environment friendly, but by introducing plastic, could we in the longer run be doing harm to the soil and so forth? So a lot of these residues, a lot of this degraded microplastics are going in the farm. So just a new way for you to think of in agriculture. And I'll finish with permaculture, which is one of my favorite techniques, my favorite terms. So I talked about regenerative agriculture, sustainable agriculture, organic agriculture, and some of them mean different things. Organic is very extreme in a sense. It says like absolutely nothing. People have found out more relaxed certifications. But permaculture is basically, and I think it relates more to our sister story as well, of bringing forests close to home or bringing nature close to home. So you have your home, and around your home, you'll have animal husbandry, you'll have fishes, you'll have aquaculture, greenhouses, and then you bring like more varieties in there. So as you go, like the different zones have different set of practices, and you think that permaculture is called permanent culture. And if you bring like nature back into close to your home, that is what people think is the future that we should have in the city, where we should have these green zones. We should know that this is the housing society. This is where each household should have a certain reliance on kitchen gardening, some sort of farming close to home, and then zone 2, 3, 4, and so on. So every zone has a set of requirements, but this is one of my favorite terms or my favorite concepts when it comes to sustainable agriculture. But the key word is mimicking nature. And hopefully when you meet Assessor next time, you will see how he is mimicking nature and how he is applying it and how he now has thousands of followers in Pakistan, India, who are following his technique. I will stop there. On the clock.